news tonight, His Majesty the King presents the Supreme Commander's flag to 3 Royal Air Force fighter squadrons in a ceremony at an air base. Israel's Prime Minister is seeking new punitive measures against stone throwers as tensions remain high at Jerusalem's Al-Aqsa Mosque for a 4th consecutive day. And scores of migrants begin crossing the border into Croatia, opening up a new route to the European Union after Hungary closes its border. Good evening and welcome to a new edition of the news. His Majesty the King, the Supreme Commander of the Jordan Armed Forces Arab Army, presented the Supreme Commander's flag to 3 fighter squadrons of the Muwaffaq al-Salti Air Base. The royal honor comes as a tribute to the pilot of the 1st, 2nd and 6th fighter squadrons for their bravery and an assertion of the armed forces' effort in defending the country and its people. The Supreme Commander's flag, which is presented by the King himself, is the highest military honor to combat units of the Jordan Armed Forces Arab Army. The ceremony, which took place at a military ceremony at the desert base of Azraq, was attended by royal family members, the Prime Minister and top military and civic officials. His Majesty the King discussed on the telephone with Morocco's monarch, King Mohammed VI, and French President François Hollande, Israeli attacks against Al-Aqsa Mosque in occupied Jerusalem. King Abdullah has contacted other world leaders as part of Jordan's bid to end the Israeli escalation. During the phone calls, King Abdullah voiced his strong condemnation of the Israeli attacks and urged the international community to pressure Israel to stop its breaches against the holy shrines. Israeli forces remained heavily deployed in and around Al-Aqsa Mosque compound in occupied Jerusalem's Old City. Israel's police provided escort to ultra-Orthodox Jews into the compound in ongoing provocations, while severely restricting the access of Palestinian worshippers into one of Islam's sacred sites. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu warned that his right-wing government would take punitive measures as a deterrence against stone throwers' youth. Here's more.
Tensions remain high at Jerusalem's Al-Aqsa Mosque compound amid recurring Israeli assaults and violations of its sanctity. In the latest provocation, more than a dozen Jewish extremists, escorted by Israeli police, stormed the Haram al-Sharif compound, Islam's 3rd holiest shrine. Meanwhile, Israeli troops and border police continue to impose strict restrictions on the entry of Palestinians into the compound, also known as the Noble Sanctuary. Under pressure from extremists and right-wingers in his coalition, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu said his government would act aggressively to restore what he called calm to Jerusalem.
We are changing our policy. The current situation is not acceptable. We are going to provide the police and the soldiers with tools in order to act aggressively against the stone throwers and the Molotov cocktail throwers.
Netanyahu's comments didn't seem to represent a change of policy, as he wants to impose more penalties on Palestinians, including minors.
We are going to adopt changes in the orders of opening fire and at implementing minimum punishment on stone and Molotov cocktail throwers. Also, I'm going to swift legislation to set mandatory minimum penalties against minors and their families in order to create deterrence.
But for Palestinians, defending Al-Aqsa Mosque is a sacred job against any attempts by Israeli ultra-Orthodox Jews and settlers.
We will knock on every door to raise the voice of Jerusalem high. God's will, we will move forward. We salute you and we salute those who are at standoff. We salute every blood drop that was spilled for Jerusalem. That is pure blood.
Israel's continued storming of Al-Aqsa Mosque brought condemnation, including from the Gulf Cooperation Council, the GCC. At a meeting in the Saudi capital Riyadh, Qatari Foreign Minister Khalal Al-Atiyah said Israel's acts of denying worshippers entry to Al-Aqsa Mosque was very dangerous and revealed Israel's unprecedented violation of the sanctity of Al-Aqsa Mosque. Radbush for the news at 10.
The government expressed its full support for His Majesty the King's relentless effort to safeguard Islamic and Christian holy sites in occupied Jerusalem and fend off Israeli attacks and violations of their sanctity. In a meeting chaired by Prime Minister Abdullah Mansour, the cabinet underlined the King's firm position, which reflected the deep concern and indignation of all Jordanians toward the latest Israeli escalation. The ministers underscored the King's affirmation that the continued Israeli provocation would affect Jordanian-Israeli relation. Foreign Minister Nasser Joudeh briefed the ministers about Jordan's diplomacy with world powers over Israeli breaches in Jerusalem, which would inflame passion of all Muslims and increase extremism and hatred. The Senate also issued a statement supporting the King's effort to counter the Israeli onslaught on Jerusalem's holy shrines, saying Jerusalem and Al-Aqsa Mosque are the responsibility of all Arabs and Muslims. Yemeni Vice President and Prime Minister Khalid returned to the southern port city of Aden in a step towards restoring a government on home soil. The exiled government of internationally backed President Abd Rabbo Mansour Hadi has for months been working from Saudi Arabia. The government spokesman said Bahah was accompanied by 7 ministers when he arrived in Aden, which loyalist fighters backed by Saudi-led troops recaptured from Houthi militias in July. In the ongoing conflict, Yemeni forces fought against Iranian-backed Houthi militiamen in the country's 3rd largest city of Taz. The clashes have been going on since the Houthis stepped back from Aden. The fighting has left much of the city in ruins and its residents pinned down inside their homes. Australian Defence Minister Kevin Andrews said Australian aircraft dropped bombs on targets of the Daesh militant groups in Syria for the first time. Andrews confirmed the mission that occurred 2 days ago. News of the incident first broke with a statement issued by the Combined Joint Task Force Office in control of Operation Inherent Resolve, the Allied bombing campaign against Daesh in Syria and Iraq. It also comes as reports emerge that Russia is rapidly renovating an old Syrian air base to hold its own military aircraft. These will operate in support of the embattled regime of Syrian President Bashar al-Assad and will likely make coalition operations against Daesh all the more complex. Meanwhile, the United Nations Children Fund, UNICEF, said they are seeing a dramatic increase in malnutrition among children in Syria since the beginning of the conflict. A UNICEF video showed extremely malnourished children being treated in medical facilities in Aleppo and Damascus. UNICEF said an assessment of nutritional status of displaced children conducted in 2014 rated the level of global acute malnutrition in Aleppo, Hama and Deir ez-Zor as serious and the overall nutrition situation poor. Officials said they tried to provide nutritional care this year to 1.3 million children by opening up malnutrition prevention and treatment services and training local health workers, community volunteers and women's groups. UNICEF said 15 more nutrition centers are scheduled to open in Homs, Hama and Aleppo by the end of the year, bringing the total to 75. A 160-soldier-strong American fighting force arrived in Iraq in preparation for a decisive battle against Daesh in the center of the country. Iraqi military officials said the battalion was secretively deployed to the frontline province of Anbar, west of the capital, Baghdad. Meantime, 2 of the 18 Turkish workers kidnapped in Baghdad this month have been released near the southern oil city of Basra. The Turkish ambassador in Baghdad said the Turks were in good health. The Turkish workers appeared in a video days after their abduction, apparently held by an armed group that used a familiar Shiite Muslim slogan and threatened to attack Turkish interests in Iraq if its demands were not met. It is not clear if the gunman belonged to an established group. Police in Beirut clashed with anti-corruption demonstrators trying to break through barbed wire protecting Lebanon's parliament. Several people were arrested. Inside parliament, representatives of the country's political faction held a second round of talks aimed at resolving their differences after failing to do so a week ago. You Stink, a citizens group that emerged in protest at rubbish festering in the streets of the capital, had called for a new round of dialogue. Dozens of riot police clashed with the most young protesters, making at least 25 arrests, according to the organizers of the protest. The United Nations Refugee Agency, the UNHCR, voiced shock at Hungary's turning back of refugees and preventing them from entering the European Union with water cannons and tear gas. Scores of migrants began crossing the border into Croatia, opening up a new route to the European Union as violence broke out on Hungary's now closed frontier. Here's more.
The crisis at the Hungarian border has reached a breaking point. Police are resorting to tear gas and water cannons to deter the protesting migrants demanding entrance from Serbia. Hungary's crackdown has forced refugees and migrants to search for a new route. Buses have been shuttling people by the hundreds to Croatia, where police are registering some and sending them to reception centers. One Syrian man on Serbia's side of the border says they just want to continue on their journey.
Just want to pass. We don't want anything.
For those still crossing through Hungary, they now face deportation. A court there already found this Iraqi man guilty of illegally crossing the country's border. He's been sentenced to 1-year expulsion, and many more migrants have already been caught. Despite the crackdown, those arriving in Greece say they are not deterred.
We are desperate. We are fleeing for a better future for my daughter and the baby I am expecting. I am leaving to offer a better life to my children. If I have to climb mountains or die to succeed, I will.
And with a long road ahead of them, the journey appears to be getting more difficult than ever.
The White House announced that President Barack Obama and Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu will meet on November 9th to discuss the Iran nuclear deal as well as other regional security issues. For the second time in a week, U.S. Senate Democrats blocked legislation meant to kill the Iran deal negotiated by the Obama administration and other world powers with Tehran. By a vote of 56 to 42, the Republican majority Senate fell short of the 60 votes needed in the 100-member chamber to advance the legislation. The result was similar to last week's procedural vote on the Iran measure, but the two Republicans opposed to the deal, presidential candidates Rand Paul and Lindsey Graham, did not vote. Activists welcome a UN call for Sri Lankan state forces and Tamil Tigers to face prosecution for alleged war crimes by a special court with international judges. The crimes include mass killing of civilians. The report called on Colombo to remove from office military and security force personnel and any other official who were involved in human rights violation in the 26-year war. Here's more.
Sri Lanka's civil war ended in 2009 after raging for more than a quarter of a century. 6 years later, the United Nations is due to release a long-delayed report into war crimes committed by the government and Tamil Tiger rebels during the conflict. Sri Lanka's new government's unveiled plans to launch a Truth and Reconciliation Commission, similar to that used by South Africa to look into the allegations. The move was announced by Sri Lanka's foreign minister in Geneva.
This mechanism is envisaged as having a dual structure, a compassionate council composed of religious dignitaries from all major religions in this country, and a structure composed of commissioners. 2, an office on missing persons based on the principle of the family's right to know, to be set up by statute with expertise from the ICRC and in line with internationally accepted standards.
The government's promised to investigate civil war atrocities by both sides, but world bodies have been frustrated by failed plans and lack of criminal indictments. South Africa is to advise Sri Lanka on its Truth and Reconciliation Commission, which it used to confront its own apartheid-era crimes. Sri Lanka is also proposing a criminal justice mechanism and compensation for the victims.
Jenson Button says his Formula One future is close to being decided, and if he does race on next season, it will only be with his beloved McLaren. The 35-year-old, the second oldest driver currently in the sport, is deciding whether he will go around again next year or end a 16-year career in which he won the 2009 World Championship. Button's future has been the source of some speculation after a frustrating season in an uncompetitive Honda engine car in which he has finished just 7th of the first 12 races. But Button, who joined McLaren in 2010 and a year after he won the world title with Brawn, said any indecision was not related to the team's performance this season. A Chinese skipper and his crew of 4 sailors have set the first record for non-stop sail of the Northeast Passage in the Arctic Ocean today. The team, led by Guo Chuan and crew members from Russia, France and Germany, crossed the finish line at the Bering Strait this afternoon. It took the group 13 days to reach the Bering Strait after their departure from the Russian port of Murmansk on September 3rd.
3, 2, 1. 16:45 UTC.
And now let's see what the weather has in store for us. Moderate in the hilly areas for the rest of tonight and relatively hot elsewhere in the country, with a chance for thundery showers, especially across the country's south. Hot weather is forecast for much of the country tomorrow, with a continued chance for light rain in the south. Winds will be westerly changing to northwesterly brisk, stirring up dust in the south and east of the country. The weatherman warns of poor visibility due to dust. Next are the lows and highs for tonight and tomorrow. And to end the news, here's a recap of our top stories. His Majesty the King presents the Supreme Commander's flag to 3 Royal Air Force fighter squadrons in a ceremony at an airbase. Israel's Prime Minister is seeking new punitive measures against stone throwers as tensions remains high at Jerusalem's Al-Aqsa Mosque for a 4th consecutive day. And scores of migrants begin crossing the border into Croatia, opening up a new route to the European Union after Hungary closes its border. And with this we come to an end. I'm Farah Ajlouni. Thank you for watching and have a good night.